Welcome to Shepherd Peace Ministries. I'm Nathan Clark. And here, as we continue our look into questions and answers in Genesis, we're going to be looking at a little bit different question. My last lesson, we talked about when was Adam formed. And in that, we mentioned the idea that souls may have been created on one day and then placed in his body on another day, which stimulated the question of when were the souls created? What is the origin of our souls? So that's the question we're going to look at today. It may not necessarily be right here in Genesis, but nonetheless, we're talking about the creation. We're talking about the beginning. So I think it's important that we have a little bit of a look into what are the origins of our souls. And at first, it might not seem like that's a very big question, but what I found when looking into this is that if we don't get this right, it really opens up doors to some pretty deep heresies in theology. And I want to help you to avoid that. So we're gonna look at that today. Before we do, I think it's important that we have a basic understanding about the soul. For a lot of times when we hear the word soul and spirit, we separate that from our bodies in such a way because we can't taste, feel, or touch it, per se. And so it's almost a mysterious aspect. And so we've become comfortable with the idea that whenever we talk about souls, that we're talking about something, a ghost. We're talking about something that has to be almost beyond comprehension. Well, there's a lot we don't know about the souls. A lot. And the Bible actually doesn't spend a lot of time talking about our body, soul, and spirit connections. It makes references to our soul, reference to our spirit. It talks about our bodies a lot. Sometimes it actually crosses over and you have to really sit down and think, what part is it actually talking about? The physical, the spiritual, or just the consciousness, which is where our soul is. Why that is? Maybe it's because for God, it's just not really something that we need to really understand. We just need to understand that we don't want our consciousness to be condemned to hell for all eternity. But we're going to look into we do have a soul. And we're going to look into the origin of that soul. But we have to understand that our soul is created. Our bodies are created and we get that. Because we can taste, feel, and touch it. Our souls, we think, we forget, I think, that they're created, that they are something that can be destroyed. They're something that God put together. They were not always in existence. And so if we enter into this discussion, or in this look, I hope to help you understand, I needed a little help to understand, is that when we begin to look at the soul as maybe it's not quite as complicated as we want it to be as far as comparing it to our body. And I think that's the key. It's the comparison to our body. Our bodies, as David said, is fearfully and wonderfully made. It's beyond anything that we can truly understand. We think we understand it, but we really don't. And every time we begin to learn a little something new about our bodies, it just shows how little we really know. But then we begin to take our souls and say, oh, it's even more unbelievable. Well, perhaps it's not. Perhaps the soul is no more complicated than our body, but our body is beyond anything we can understand. But our souls may be at that same level, beyond anything we can understand, but not necessarily beyond the creation of our body. It is a created thing. All right, so let's begin. There are three basic views of the origin of the souls. There's a fourth one. We're not going to look at that one at all, but I'll go ahead and mention it, and we'll just get it out of the way. The fourth view, the one we're not going to really look at, is the idea that our souls come straight from God. They were never created. They have always been, and it's a piece of God inside of us. Now, that is 100% unbiblical. I'm not even going to bother to address that. It's heresy, but it is out there. We are not God. God may dwell in us, but God is not us. We are not God. We are not even a piece of God. We are created. God put us together. And I don't have all the understanding on that either, but we are not God. All right, so I got that one out of the way. But the other three positions, and these will be the ones you're going to run into. We'll start with preexistent. Preexistent is the belief that our souls, now this is kind of what we addressed a little bit in our last lesson, looking at when Adam was formed. Preexistence is the belief that our souls were made on day number 6, and they're just kept in some special place, and then every time a child is conceived, then God places a soul into that conception. Like he might have placed a soul that he pre-created, then he created Adam's body, and then he takes a soul and places it into Adam's body. All right, so that's theory number 1. The next one is creationism. It's called creationism. The first one is called preexistence. The next one is creationism. Creationism is the belief that every time a child is conceived, God then creates a brand new soul and then places it into that child's body. And then the third one is traditionism. That is the belief that Adam had the original soul, and from that, souls are somewhat transferred on almost a genetic aspect. That when a mother and a father come together and conception happens, that not only is there a reproduction of a new body, but in that point, there's also a reproduction of a new soul. All right, so let's back up, and we're going to look at all three of these and see what the pros and cons, the dangers and the not dangers might be. So let's start with preexistence. Preexistence dates back to 553 AD at the Council of Constantinople, where great men sat down and they come up with this idea. They decided together that this is the most logical aspect of where our souls come from. Their confirmational verses are Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5. Let's turn there. Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5. We all know this verse, or at least probably heard it somewhere along the line. It says, before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. Now this is God speaking to Jeremiah. Verse 4 says, then the word of the Lord came unto me, saying. So this is the words of God to Jeremiah. Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. Before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee. I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. Okay, so that verse insinuates that God had a relationship of some sort with Jeremiah prior to being formed in the body. Now the word formed, that speculates a lot. We're not even going to walk down that road. Here, we're not going to look at what process of the formation in the body that Jeremiah was looking at. We'll go ahead and say that it was from conception on. It doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't guarantee that, but for the sake of argument, we'll look at this as that it's from conception on. So, God knew Jeremiah before he was conceived. Only way that makes sense is that there must have been a soul that God was getting to know ahead of time, or even if the soul itself didn't have consciousness, God was somehow able to interact. Is that the only option for this verse? Well, I do get that is an option, but I don't think it's the only option. I don't think we have to box God into that. And here's what I think is possible. It is possible when we see verses like this that God knows us ahead of time, that God operates outside of time. We operate in time. The only way this verse could be true for you and me is if I knew something of Jeremiah before he was conceived. But for God, it's a totally different situation. God can step out of time. God could know Jeremiah for his entire life. Not just his soul, but what he's going to do, what he's not going to do, his great feats, his failures. He knows Jeremiah from conception to the end. And he knows it before he was conceived. Because God does not operate inside of time. I think that's very plausible. I'm not saying the other one isn't plausible. I'm just saying that that's not the only option we have. And for me, and this is just me, I tend to lean towards the idea that this verse is talking about God operating out of time, and God saying that I know all about you long before you were ever placed in the womb of your mother, because I am God. Not because, oh, well, I'm God and I have to, the only way I can get to know you is if there was something created ahead of time. Okay? So we don't want to box God in. All right, well, there's another verse let's look to that might confirm that this idea that our souls were created ahead of time. Let's turn to Revelation. Let's go to Revelation chapter 3. Revelation chapter 3, verse 5. He that overcometh, the same shall be clothed in the white raiment, and I will not blot out his name out of the book of life, but I will confess his name before the Father and before his angels. So this book of life, this is not the only place. We're not going to look into this real deep, but the Lamb's book of life is where a list of names is present. Names that had been preordained from the foundation of the earth. If we were to turn to Revelation chapter 13, verse 7, I guess we'll look at one more. It says, it was given unto him to make war with the saints and overcome them, and the power was given unto him all kindreds and tongues of nations, and I will dwell upon the earth and worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So we know that this book of life, the names that are in it or not in it, go all the way back to the beginning of the creation. It's already, my name's already in that book. My grandchildren that are saved are already in that book. So that indicates, well, okay, if this is true, then God had to have known these people ahead of time. Those are the verses. So predestination and kind of confirms the idea that our souls were made ahead of time, because from that, God chooses from the bank of souls who he's going to save. All right. Now, there's a few problems with this theory. The idea that souls were created ahead of time, placed into bodies. Here's some problems. Now, we're not going to mention them all. There's a bundle. And there's a bundle for the other ones as well, maybe. Maybe not all of them. But for a couple of these, they have problems as well. But we're not going to look at every single one of them. But we're going to look at the big ones. And these are the big ones for me. The first problem that I have with this preexistence is that it forces God to violate his own law of kind after kind. How does that work? We're going to use the example of the angels and the daughters of men in Genesis, where they produced the giants. Giants were not a part of God's original design. In fact, it angered God so bad that it was the straw that broke the camel's back and caused a flood. Let's not forget that. That's how grievous that act was to God. So God, if we believe that all the souls were created ahead of time, then that means that we're saying that God created souls for individuals ahead of time that he doesn't ordain. It means that God is violating his own law. I have trouble with that. The second big one that I struggle with in this particular theory is that if there are souls separate from the fallen world, placed in heaven somewhere, wherever they may be, then that means that those souls are untainted by sin nature. And so when a child is conceived, a sinless soul is placed into their body. Now that goes against what the Bible teaches. Now, one might say that, well, it's not the soul that causes sin, but it's the physical body that's the issue. It's the fallen body, Nathan. The soul just kind of follows the body. Wrong. Absolutely, positively wrong. And I'm going to show you from the Bible the idea that the body follows the soul. No, sir. Our bodies are fallen. That means that my fingers might not be the right length. That means that I might be born with a limp. It means my brain's not functioning at its highest capacity. Someone might have birth defects, whatever it may be. I might be prone to certain illnesses. That is the evidence of a fallen body. But my fallen body is not the source of my sin nature. The soul is. And let's turn in our Bibles to Luke chapter 6, to verse number 45. Luke chapter 6, verse 45, and it says, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is good. Heart here is talking about your soul. This is an aspect of your soul, your inner consciousness. So out of the good treasures of your soul bringeth forth that which is good. And an evil man out of the evil treasures of his heart or his soul bringeth forth that which is evil. For out of the abundance of our heart, our mouth, or rather our soul, what is going on with our soul is ultimately going to dictate what? His mouth speaketh. Or that's the actions. When I speak profane things, that tells me what's going on inside of me. The soul is the driver, is the guider of sin. That is the source of our sin nature. It all starts with a feeling. I want that. I feel angry, whatever it may be. It is in our soul. So, if we have a perfect soul placed into our body, that really does change the idea that we have to be fallen. That opens up the door that I could, in fact, live a perfect life. I could, because I have a soul that hasn't done anything wrong yet. And it's not tainted by sin nature. All I got to do is just kind of isolate myself from the rest of the world, and I could be a Jesus. I won't need Jesus. That is heresy. That is dangerous road to walk down. So that is some of the doors that preexistence, the idea that our soul was created ahead of time, opens up. Dangerous roads. The next theory, or rather the next position of theology, is creationism. Now, creationism is the youngest of all these. Creationism came in about the mid-1800s, the best that I could find. Creationism has the same problem. You have the same verses that you would use to support preexistence. You use the same verses to support creationism. It's an idea that God formed when he created your soul, that he had that moment that he knew you ahead of time, and then he placed it into Jeremiah's conceived body, and then that somehow he knew Jeremiah ahead of time. And it has the same problems. If God created, think about this. We're going back to Genesis chapter 6, there at the flood, or right before the flood. These angels are procreating with the daughters of men, and God's saying, I have to create a soul for these giants which I despise, these giants which represent sin at its fullest degree, but I'm going to create a soul for them. Now think about what you're saying. One would be saying that God not only ordains sin, but he's going to participate in the sin. Wow, that's dangerous. And of course, the other one, where God creates a soul. If the soul, we just saw, sin nature is sourced from the soul. So if God creates a soul and places it in your body, it has to be perfect. It has to be sinless. Otherwise, God's creating a defective soul. Are we willing to walk down that road? That God can create imperfection? He may allow imperfection to occur, but he doesn't create it. But those are the positions that we would have to take if we were to buy in to, we'll say, the creationism point of view, is that God will participate in sin and actually create sin. And then there's a third one that's added into this, and that is the idea that God is still creating. So we saw in Genesis chapter 2, in our last study, that God came to the end of his creation. So we're just going to recap that again. Genesis chapter 2, verse number 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. The host of them means everything else. We have the heavens that we can kind of relate to. We got the third heaven, the second heaven, and the first heaven. Then we got earth. We can really relate to that. And then the host of them. That might be the planet, but that's everything else. Everything else that we can relate to or can't relate to. All of creation was done. And it says, verse 2, and it says, on the seventh day, God ended his works which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day of all his works which he had made. That was it. So, in order for God to continue to create souls, would be an indicator that God is stepping outside of these verses and continuing to make more and more things, even though he said, I'm pretty much done. All right. Now, this brings us to Traditionism. Traditionism came out about the late 300 AD. Now, it actually was, it comes from a stimulation of a particular point of view. Pelagianism. Pelagius had this idea that because of what we just mentioned, that sin was something that occurred after we were born, not before we were born. That you were born a perfect person, and then you fell over time. Now it's actually called the Pelagius heresy. So Pelagianism caused a few people to go back to the drawing board because they couldn't argue that where they're standing, which the vast majority of them were standing with preexistence, the idea, if all the souls are kept somewhere safe, then he's right that when they place into a body, that soul is not sinned yet. That really changes the way we view Scripture. So they went back to the drawing board. And so this is what they came up with. And what they came up with was traditionalism, which is the idea that perhaps our souls are transferred from one person to another through conception, just like our genes. There's a lot of stuff about our genetics that we don't understand. And the idea, now here's where the real challenge is. The only problem that I can find with traditionalism is that it challenges the thinking that our souls are created. It brings the created aspect of our souls into focus. And a lot of times, for some reason, we don't want that. Perhaps maybe it challenges our thinking that God created us, our soul was somehow something that makes us unique. Well, this doesn't change the fact that you're unique. This doesn't change the fact that God has his hand in everything. But it does explain a lot. It explains the idea why family members can have similar temperaments. My daughter, on the emotional aspect, we're talking about the soul, she feels and acts a lot like me. This is separate from the physical body. It's not genes. This is something deeper. This is the soul. How is that possible? Well, perhaps she's got a part of my soul in her. This would explain that. The souls of the fallen angels. The souls of anything that happens outside of God's original design. How do we explain those souls? This would explain it. Which also brings an entire heightening of the importance of why we need to operate in God's Word, because when we start stepping outside of the law of kind after kind, we're not just messing with the physical body. We're messing with souls. I don't have the answer. What happens? But all I'm saying is that you need to be very careful when you're willing to follow a lustful desire, a stimulation, and have no concern for what might be happening in a realm that you know nothing about, in the realm of our souls. And like I said, this explains how that is possible. It puts no shame on God. It does not cause God to sin. It does not cause God to participate in sin. It's just a natural effect that happens in God's creation. And of course, it explains how the soul can be in its fallen state. If a soul is transferred from one fallen, starting with Adam and Eve, is transferred to the next, the soul is already fallen, just like the physical bodies that we see and taste, feel, and touch. the soul would be the same. It explains that to me quite clearly, how our soul is then transferred in a fallen state. And it also explains why people, the offspring, will have certain tendencies towards the same sins of the parents. Now, some might argue, oh, well, that's environmental. You can be an alcoholic, kick the habit, get married, have children, and your children may have, as a high probability that one or two of your children may have an issue with alcoholism. Why? They've never been around it. It was not an environmental issue. It was a sin that was transferred from one soul to the next. This explains all that. Now, I actually have quite a list here. We're not going to, due to time, we're not going to go through that whole list. But traditionalism, to me, it explains a lot. It answered far more questions than it caused. Now, if you have a question, if this stimulates a question for you, I want to hear it. I looked for all these other ones. Now, there were several questions. Well, what about this? Well, what about that? This one here, the only question that I could really come up with is the idea that this is talking about something that's not quite as supernatural as I would want to believe. It just forces me to rethink the idea, the understanding of what my soul might be. Outside of that, I find that this point of view is very strong. And on the verses to support it. Well, let's start in Hebrews chapter 9. There are. Now again, am I going to show you a verse that says this position is just plain and clear, our souls come from each other? No. And that's unfortunate that this particular subject is not very clear in the Bible. I have to admit that. And so that being said, I'm not necessarily into big labels. Am I saying that this particular label covers me 100%? No. But I am saying the principles behind this label seem to fit the Scripture and to fit the environment around me the best. Where the other ones, they're really dangerous. They're really dangerous, and then it could be because there's a lot that I don't understand about it, and I submit that. But we have to be careful when we start giving God ownership for sin. All right, so let's look at Hebrews chapter 7, verse 9. Now, what we're trying to establish here is that somehow our soul is transferred genetically, right? That's kind of what we're looking at here. So in 7 verse 9, all right, it says, and as may so say, Levi also, who receiveth tithe, paid tithe in Abraham. All right, we're jumping in the middle of a story, so I'm going to have to recap this real quick. What we're having is we're going back to the Old Testament, where Abraham paid tithe to the priest Melchizedek, the high priest of Salem. And what is being said here is that when Abraham paid those tithes, that Levi was paying tithe as well. Now, obviously, Levi was not physically present. Levi wasn't born for many years. We had Abraham, and then we had Isaac, and then we have Jacob, and then we have Levi, and then his descendants. So we're talking several generations later before Levi even comes on the scene, yet it's giving Levi credit for paying tithe. That sounds like we're talking about that Levi's, we'll say, his personality, his consciousness, not his physical body, but who he is on the inside, was present there at that paying of tithe. How is that possible? Only if God saw that through Abraham's soul would then finally come Levi's soul as it branches out. Let's say Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Very familiar verse. 5, verse 12, and it says, Wherefore, as by one man sin entered in the world, that being Adam, and death by sin. And so death passed on to all men. So the consequences of one man passed on to everybody. I want you to think about that. Does that sound like a just God? Well, and for my reading, I'll go finish the verse, and it says, For all have sinned. This verse is pretty clearly saying that we are responsible for everything that happened in the Garden of Eden. How is that possible? Well, if we are branches of Adam that just continue to branch out, and we're just carrying that same soul, begins to branch, which, by the way, Traditionism actually means vine or branch. And that's the theory behind it, is that we just continue, our souls just continue to branch off of the original tree. That would explain how this verse works. That sin, the consequences of sin passed to Seth, Adam's son, passed to Seth because Seth is carrying a piece of Adam's fallen soul. So he's carrying the sin with him, which means that he carries the consequence of the sin with him. You can't carry the consequence of the sin with you if the sin doesn't follow you. So if Seth had a new soul, one that was hidden in heaven somewhere, or a brand new soul created in its perfection, placed into Seth, he could not carry the consequences of Adam. It would be new consequences, if anything else. New, not old. But I am still carrying Adam's original consequence. Do you see that? Which means to me that there has to be something about my fallen sin nature, my soul, that connects all the way back to Adam. Now, I don't know if these make sense to you or not. And again, I submit that the soul is not something that's very clear in the Bible. So I offer these as ideas, if nothing else, food for thought. I encourage you to do your own study and to see where you come out on this. But be careful to just randomly accept a particular point of view. Because for many years in my life, I accepted a particular point of view that I now see was dangerously covered in attributing God to sin and attributing heresy to my belief system that a child could be born into this world without sin nature, which vastly goes against the Word of God, which I believe to be true, inerrant, every page from beginning to end, regardless of what the world has to say. Well, I thank you for your time, and may God bless you. Have a wonderful afternoon.